Welcome to my Cybersecurity Foundations course. And hopefully, this course will give you all the things you need to prepare you to successfully go into an actual cybersecurity boot camp or whatever type of training it is that you're looking to go into as it relates to cybersecurity. So, we're going to start and kind of go through and just kind of outline for you all the things that we're going to do in the course and give you some background on some of the fundamentals and why some of the things are the way that they are. So, who is this course for? Well, so definitely for people trying to enter into cybersecurity, but also I put this together for people who already may have gotten a career in cybersecurity and kind of started their career and been in for a few years, and got to a certain point and realized that maybe you have some gaps in your knowledge base. You want to go back and grab those fundamental things that you had to skip past because maybe you were kind of trial by fire into cybersecurity. Someone just threw you in the deep end and said, do this work. Also, for people considering entering cybersecurity, maybe you haven't decided that you're going to do it yet, but you're interested. So you want to take some time, invest a little bit of time into finding out exactly what it's about, what you'll be required to know, and what that might look like. And then lastly, people in other industries who need cybersecurity knowledge. For example, I've worked with a lot of auditors that don't necessarily do cybersecurity, but they need some basic knowledge of how cybersecurity works for them to be able to properly do their audit. And I'll give you a big long anecdote about that when we get to the cybersecurity auditing module that we'll do towards the end of this course. But there's a lot of industries that are kind of dependent on cybersecurity, for these people to do their jobs. They may be not traditionally used to be cybersecurity, but they've evolved into that. Even within law enforcement, everyone that's in law enforcement will tell you that a lot of the crimes that used to be traditional hands-on crimes are now cyber crimes. We used to have a lot of people going into banks physically with a gun to rob a bank. Now they rob the bank via hacking into the bank's database and stealing money that way. A lot of people that commit traditional crimes like murders and things like that, well, they do things like look up how to, hide a body and these things on the internet. Well, that becomes a cyber investigation at that point, or a digital forensics investigation. So for those people, I put this out there for you as well, because hopefully it will give you some insight into the things that have just kind of been like smoke and mirrors, dark Jedi secrets, kind of open that up, pull the curtain back, and show you what those fundamental things are. Now, what will we be covering in this learning path? Well, obviously operating systems, because what you find out is when it comes to cybersecurity, it really is just a combination of how we're trying to secure the systems, the networks, and the data that we utilize to compute and do our day-to-day things. When you look at it from the perspective of how we look at it, you're either storing your data or you're moving your data from one place to another, or you're computing or processing that data. When you store that data, you use hard drives, which is generally an extension of a piece of hardware that's connected to an operating system. When you process your data, you're using a computer's RAM and memory to do that, which is part of, yet again, an operating system. And when you're moving your data from one place to the other, you're using your internal network or you're using the internet or some other medium, but all of that happens over what we call a network. It's a digital network that's used to move your data from one place to the other. And when you're doing either of those things, we have to come up with ways to secure that. And that's some of the foundations of what cybersecurity is. There's always also network and security foundations that we'll be looking at. So again, in order for you to understand how to secure these things, you need at least a very fundamental understanding of how these things work. If I asked you to secure my car, as it goes from one place to another, and I didn't tell you what that place was or how the car is going to get there, you would have a hard time securing it. So we're going to look at some specifics of that. Also, policies, procedures, frameworks, and foundations. We're going to be looking at, how do we make sure we're doing those things? Once we figure out this is what we need to do to secure it, how do we ensure that those things are happening? How do we know that we're doing it the right way? And how do we make sure that others that come after us will know how to do these things? Those things are called policies, procedures, and frameworks. The frameworks give us what we generally need to build policies and procedures. Policies kind of govern how we should do things, and procedures are almost like step by steps of how to, be in compliance with that policy, for example. And that's a very high level elementary definition of it, but that's basically what it is. Okay. Cybersecurity audit, we're definitely going to spend some time looking at that because, that's another control piece that basically describes how we're going to be doing these things. And then, of course, risk management. Everything that we talk about in cybersecurity can be tied back to risk, because if there's no risk of something happening, then why would we spend money to prevent it? So when we look at these cybersecurity risk and we look at the things that are happening in the industry, some of the things that make the news may not apply to every organization in the world. How do you find out what your risk or your exposure is to that hack or to that threat actor or to that data breach? How do you find it out? Well, we do that in risk management. That's what risk management people spend most of their time doing. And we'll give you a behind the curtains look at what that is as well, to really make sure that you understand how all these pieces work together. And more importantly, you come away knowing that no single piece is really more important than the other. All the pieces that make up what we call cybersecurity are very important. Things I've heard frequently from students, and these things are really what inspired me to create this. So the first one is information overload. The boot camp I took was too much information too fast. The term that I hear the most, fire hose. They always say, I feel like someone sit me in a desk, took a fire hose like that the firemen use to put out a fire, and basically just fire hose me with information. And I absorbed some of it, but most of it was coming so fast and so at such a high volume that most of it just went right past my head. A lot of that is because some of that water that's coming out of that fire hose is things that you should have already known before you got in that boot camp. So what we're planning to do here is to try to make sure we give you the opportunity to absorb those things and get those things so that when that fire hose comes on, you can ignore some of that information because some of it you've already retained and it's part of your brain. Second thing I hear is the retention. Okay, I got all this information. I felt like I knew it that day, but a week after the class was over, I felt like I'd forgotten 90% of what I learned. So we're going to try to look at some ways to help you retain the information. And believe it or not, the retention issue is directly related to the first issue, which is information overload. If you're getting too much too fast, it affects how much of it you can remember. Okay, so we'll look at some ways to kind of deal with that. The third thing, unrealistic employer expectations. And this is the thing that I hear the most from people that leave my classes and then go get that first job. Now, the reason I say maybe here is because what I found is there's actually two parts to this problem. One, there's clearly some employer expectations that are kind of bloated or, out of sync with reality. But I also find that a lot of times we have to be realistic about what our actual skill sets are. Just because if a job description says, I want you to be competent in this specific subject, I want you to be able to run Nmap scans, I want you to be competent running a penetration test. Because you've done it one time in a class successfully does not mean you're competent in it. I want you to think about something. When I first learned to drive, when my dad taught me to drive, the very first time I was able to leave our yard, go down the street, come back and successfully get into the parking garage, I felt as though I had conquered a mountain. But guess what happened a week later? We went out again and I totally sideswiped the big tree at the edge of our yard as I was going out of the yard. This is because I didn't yet understand the intricacies of rearview mirrors and blind spots in your turn radius and all these things. Those things I could not possibly understand from that first lesson. These are things that I went on to learn over time. When you apply for a job that says, can you do A, B, and C, or are you competent in this area? You need to understand that means more than have you done it before. Because just because you've done something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're competent or you're capable of even doing it again. Okay. So That problem, unrealistic employer expectations, I see that as kind of more of a mixture of that plus, sometimes we go into a job because we want that job, we want that money, we want that prestige, saying we're a pen tester or, whatever it is, whatever the hottest job of the day is in cybersecurity. But you have to understand you need to be able to do these things and be confident doing them. And this course is going to help you to get to that point by building on foundations. 4, the thing that I hear, I wish I'd known more Linux, Windows command line before I took this course. All right. This applies mostly to technical courses, but others as well. Really, when you guys are saying that, what I found out is that's not what you really mean. What you're really saying is you wish you had more experience typing Windows and Linux commands. Now, there's a whole little piece that I'll go into about that, and we'll address that. There's some things we can look at. So let's look at the information overload problem first. So essentially, you should have known some of it before attending. This is what I started with, and part of why I'm creating this course is to give you some of that information. We should do a better job of getting you clear prerequisites. When we bring you into a boot camp or into a course, yes, as an industry, we can do a better job of making sure that you know what you should have as a foundational skill set coming in. And what I'm telling you now, and why I'm putting this course out, is everything that we go over in this course, you should be comfortable doing these things before you take any cybersecurity boot camp. All right. And you will generally meet most of the prerequisites. Some of it you may not actually need to know at this stage. Some of the things that you get in these courses, you don't necessarily need at that stage. Another reason for me creating this is to take out a lot of the noise and just make sure you have the tangibles so that you can move forward. The other problem, information retention problem. Again, some of it shouldn't be retained. Just like some of the information you don't need at this point, some of it you don't need to try to retain either. So part of the challenge is you need to know what parts you need to remember and which parts are just of interest that maybe you can forget about, and then you'll pick it up later when it actually applies. You likely didn't practice applying it in a way that aids in retention. And part of the exercises that I'm going to be going into in some of the later parts of this course or this learning path is to really make sure that you practice it in a way that it's going to stick. It's going to be sticky in your brain. Now, you were struggling too much with things like entering commands correctly for your brain to retain the important information. If you tell me to go as fast as I can, run from here to the next light that's a mile away, if I'm trying to get there as fast as I can, and then you come back at the end and ask me details about the houses that were on each side of the road, probably didn't see them because I was going too fast to get to that light. If you're given so much information that you're rushing to try to get through all the information and the exercises, by the time you get to the end, you made it, but you lost a lot of information or didn't even see a lot of information on the way because you were going too fast to get to that point. So we're going to shrink the time limits down, and we're going to shrink down the amount of information that you need to try to absorb, thereby increasing your attention. Okay. Now, the unrealistic employer problem. We just talked a little bit about this. Really, some employers or hiring managers really do ask for too much. I'm not disputing that. But sometimes we set ourselves up by going too fast through learning phases. All right. Let me give you an example of what I mean. At InfoSec and other places, we have done a great job of giving you a learning path. Like, look, if you want to be a pen tester, you need to do this and learn that and learn this. Or if you want to be a cybersecurity engineer or a cloud security engineer, you need to learn these things in this order. That's the best path. But what happens with some people is you do those things, but you do it at too rapid of a rate. So in other words, you move on from step 1 to step 2 before you've really even had time to absorb and comprehend what you were really doing at step 1. So by the time you get to the end, you have all these skills on paper, you have some hands-on, you can do some things, but deep down inside, you even feel, you have some gaps. You're not comfortable in that role because you know that you're missing some fundamentals. This is generally a classic sign that you just went way too fast. So part of this can be dealt with by slowing down. If let's say you're I've helped people most recently. For example, I had a person that was a registered nurse, knew nothing about computers other than how to enter the data in her computer at work when she was taking people's blood and stuff like that. Within a 8-month period, I took her from knowing nothing to now she's actually a cybersecurity vulnerability scanning engineer. She runs Nessus and Nexpose and other vulnerability scanners, configures them, understands details about how the plugins work, can take it and generate reports, and she's working towards a pen test position. In about 8 months, I got her to that point. But we did it in a very methodical, slow, controlled way. Now, she wants to eventually be a pen tester, and she was trying to come in and take all these boot camps, and then in 8 months, I'll be a pen tester. I've given her realistic expectation that, all right, so to be an entry-level pen tester, let's give it 18 months. Get on my 18-month program, go at that rate, and I think you'll have more success. And she's already getting offers now to be a pen tester, but it's because I'm making her go at a rate that she's actually mastering the skills at each step. So just something to think about. Now, the other thing here, I wish I knew more Linux and Windows before I took this course. Let me explain something about what I found that to mean, because when I first started hearing this about 10 years ago from students, I studied and tried to figure out what was happening and how we could get them more Linux. But what they really mean, the problem isn't that they needed more Linux or Windows command line before they got into the course. It's just that they needed their brain to be exposed to that way of thinking. Let me show you what the actual problem is. Now, there's something called hypoglycemia, and it's kind of a myth, but there's some truth to it. And let's look at what it actually means. So if you look at these two strings of text, the one at the top, it says what? Your brain will automatically put that together. And what it says is, can you read this? Now type it. Even though all the letters are completely out of whack, your brain auto-completed, auto-fixed it and arranged the characters in a way that you could read it. This is something that we all do. Part of the reason that works is because you've read these words and these combinations of letters literally millions of times. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. Now, if I give you the second line and look at that, when you think about that, it doesn't go as quickly. And here's a test I've done with students over the years, and I've proven this to be 100% true. Most of them can type and correct this first line faster than they can type that second line. And there's a critical reason for that, because in that first line, you're not actually reading this by each letter. What you're doing is you're taking that, your brain is auto-correcting it to what you see in the green there. And how it's doing that is because when you're reading it, you're actually reading it in blocks like what you see here. Because this is how we read and this is how we absorb our information in the language that we learn to read in. So what ends up happening is the word can, think about how many times you've read that. So if you think about it as using a tool, you've used the tool, the word can, millions of times. Every time you write it, every time you read it in a sentence, you're exercising that in your brain. It's becoming part of your brain. But if you look at the line at the bottom, the nmap-ss, how many times have you typed the word nmap? Most of you probably never. How many times have you typed a dash, a little s and a big S in sequence with each other? Most of you probably never have. How many times have you done dash P80, comma 224 together in a sequence? Most of you probably never. How many of you have typed 10.11.1.34? Most of you never. That's an IP address. What this is it is a common string that we would type, for example, to run an nmap scan, that is to run a hacking tool or a pen test tool against an IP address, which is like a phone number for computers, to see if ports 80 and port 224 are open on that device. And we're telling it to fragment the packets with the -F at the end. Now, the reason I could type this string, and we tested this as well, I can type this string almost as fast as I can type the second string, the first string. And part of that's because I've typed this nmap command literally thousands of times, or combinations of it. So your challenge is you've never typed this. When you type the can you read this, you actually type it or read it in blocks. So you're not really looking at each letter individually. Whereas when you type this nmap command, you're forced to actually look at and process each individual character, and that slows you down. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier, where when you're typing these commands, suddenly you're going so slow that by the time the lab session is up or you're supposed to move on, you've completely forgotten exactly what it is you were typing at the time. You get to the end, you've typed all these things, you get the thumbs up, you feel happy that you completed this exercise, but you forgot what it was you were learning at the time. And that's based 100% on this phenomenon here. Now, there's a lot of studies. You can go look at some of the stuff from some of the universities, Harvard, MIT, and others that have done tons of studies on this. But the point I'm trying to make to you is it's not that you needed more Linux or Windows. What you needed was more hands-on repetitions doing these various combinations of strings so that you can recall them quicker, which means you can focus your brain more on learning the lesson that you're doing in that exercise versus actually just trying to type the strings right. Right? Now, the first string represents patterns you've seen before. The second string, patterns you've not seen before. And I have a solution for this in some of the exercises we'll work on in the later courses. So specifically, you've used words like can and you millions of times. Reading and recognizing them counts as using. It's not just typing, but also using. Because if you are a good typist, or if you've been typing, for a part of your life, you're not thinking of every character as you type it. It kind of comes naturally for you. And when you have to think about each character individually, which is what happens when you type words that you've never seen before, or characters, strings that you've never seen before, it forces you to go back to that archaic way of looking at each character individually. And we just don't function well that way. Our brains don't work that way. Okay? Here's another string to try. Now, what this is actually a very common filter that I would use in something like Wireshark or TCP dump to say, I only want to see the traffic that's coming from and going to the IP address of 172.16.78.102, and only traffic going to or coming from port 5986. Now, I know you're intro, so half of what I said just didn't make any sense to you. What's really going on there is we're looking for traffic to and from PowerShell connections. And you might not know what PowerShell is now, but you will later when we get into the Windows command line. Why? Because in the world of hacking, a lot of hackers and threat actors will exploit your systems and move back and forth using PowerShell. And this is something that we look for in traffic oftentimes, because if you think about it, if you have a secretary that basically does secretary work all day, and you have an executive that simply answers emails and brokers deals all day, why would they ever be using PowerShell? The answer is they wouldn't. So one of the things that we look for commonly when we're doing investigations is for strings like this. Now, what I want you to think about is if I'm teaching you what I just said, and you're trying to remember that while also trying to type this foreign string here that you've never typed before, there's no familiarity there whatsoever other than maybe the word port. Now your brain has to go into slow motion to type this, and the learning of what I just said about PowerShell and how hackers use it, most of that's not going to retain because it's kind of moved to the side so that you can focus on typing this string. And as you continue to do that over and over and over, a lot of the important lessons you move to the side just to type the string. And again, by the time you get to the end, you've forgotten a lot of the lesson. So we're going to take you through this and have you type these things a bunch so that once you get into that cybersecurity course, it's not an issue anymore. So what is cybersecurity actually? Well, it is the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use, and the practice of ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information sources. This is the answer. This is the definition from US CISA. Okay. US CISA is a US government agency that deals with cybercrime, data breaches, and that type of thing. This is their definition. There's also a definition here that's from Oxford. It says the state of being protected against criminal or unauthorized use of electronic data or measures taken to achieve this particular state. Now, again, for you as an entry-level person, both of these definitions sound very foreign because, for one, some of these terms you'd have to go look up to know what they mean. So the definition itself needs a definition is what ends up happening a lot of times. And this is, again, part of why the confusion comes in. So let's break some of these terms down. So what is a network? Well, networks move data from place to place. What's a device? Devices process and store the data. And the data to this point is our most valuable asset in the world when we talk about IT and maybe humanity in general. The most valuable thing we have is data. We spend more for data than we do anything else. How do all these work together? Well, when you visit a website on the internet, you're using your device, which can store and process the data. Okay. Now, to access another device called a web server, which can also store and process data, you're accessing this data on that web server using a bunch of connected networks that allow data to move from one place to another. This includes your network at home, by the way. All right. And that's where the networks come in. How do we protect this? Because if you think about it, we got really 3 points there. We got the point of where we're using the data, that needs to be protected. The point of where we're moving the data, that needs to be protected. And the place where we're storing the data, that also needs to be protected. All right. And how do we do that? Well, there's something called the CIA triad. And this is one of the founding principles of what cybersecurity is in general. Okay. Now, the confidentiality, or the C in CIA triad, deals with keeping the data private. In other words, if I have some data and I want to make sure that no one else can see that data, I need some way to make sure that happens. And we use confidentiality to make that happen. And we'll talk about some specific examples of that here on the next page. Integrity. We need to make sure that the data that we're trusting and using has not been modified by unauthorized sources. In other words, can we trust that data? Because not all data out there can be trusted. So we need a way to make sure that the data that we're making big decisions on and making big decisions based on as well, that data has integrity applied to it and we know we can trust it. And then lastly, availability. You could have the data that's most secure and we could have massive integrity around it to where we know for sure it hasn't been modified by unauthorized sources. But if we can't get to that data when we need it, it's absolutely useless, right? So we also need to protect the availability. We need to make sure that data is there every time we need it and we can get to it expediently. And that's the purpose of availability. So everything that you ever learn in cybersecurity from this day forward can be traced back to one of these 3 things. And this is why we call it the CIA triad. Now let's look at some specifics here, or a little bit more specific. Essentially, when we look at the availability, one of the primary controls and one of the primary ways that we give ourselves that is through something called redundancy. For example, if this web server goes down, there's another web server that's waiting to take its place and serve that data out to us right away. Okay. There's also integrity. We want to make sure that when I pull that data from the website, remember that web server could be sitting in another state or another country. When I pull that data down, how do I know that the data that I'm looking at on my computer is as it were when they posted it on that website for my consumption? Well, the way we know that is because for a lot of websites, you can literally go look on the website and they'll have something called a hash that says, here's the hash that represents this data. All right. Well, what does that mean? Let's look at an example. If I go out to, let's just look at Kali Linux, and I want to download Kali Linux to do pen testing, because you'll learn about Kali Linux a lot as you go into cybersecurity. Notice of all the downloads here, on the right, there's a SHA-256 sum. That long, weird string over to the right, that's called a hash. And the purpose of that is so that when I download this, I can run the same mathematical process that these creators ran against this download to get that number. I can run that same process once I download it. And if that download is good and hasn't been modified, I should get that exact same number. That's how I will know that that file hasn't been modified and I can trust it. This is where the integrity comes in. And that string that you see is a hash that is reproducible. But the only way it can be produced again ever is if I run the same math against this download that they ran to generate it. Okay. That's where the integrity actually comes in. And that's how you use integrity in hashing. Now, the last one on the list here is confidentiality. What confidentiality is making sure that our data stays to where only the people that are authorized to see it or consume it can do that. And we generally get that through some type of encryption or authentication. Now, encryption simply means we take the data and we scramble it. Think about when you do word scramble. When you're doing word scramble, that is actually a form of encryption. Okay? Now, if you don't scramble it well enough, someone can easily look at it and figure out what that word was. We just kind of saw that when we looked at the words earlier and then when we talked about the typoglycemia complex. So the point is to make it scrambled enough that it's impossible or infeasible to unscramble it. And this is where you get into the different levels of encryption, good encryption versus bad encryption. And we'll have some more discussion around that a little bit later. The other way that we control confidentiality is through something called authentication. So we might have the data sitting here, but we don't encrypt it because we know that the only way to get there is to come through this door, right? Or to authenticate through that door. Now we replace that door with the login page or something of that nature. That's another way that we give ourselves confidentiality. As a matter of fact, part of the reason we have cybersecurity problems is back in the day when computers were first created, they were only in the form of what we call mainframes and things of that nature, which meant for you to get access to the data on that computer, you had to physically get into that building. And we're talking about government installations that were protected by people with machine guns. So it wasn't an easy task to get into that building. So the security of it and the confidentiality of that data was the fact that you can't even get into the building. And the assumption was anybody in the building has access to the data. That's old school. But now we apply that same principle, but we can put these things together. We can tie them together. We can have authentication on the one side so that only people that can get past that authentication gets to the data, but we can separately encrypt it so that even if they get to it, they now have to decrypt it to be able to read it. And this is where you start to hear things like layered security or layers of security, or you might hear it called defense in depth, but it all means the same thing. Now, these are terms that you need to kind of get baked into your brain because you're going to hear them throughout your cybersecurity career. You know, there's no easy answer here, but what I can tell you is we need more qualified people doing cybersecurity jobs. I've got some numbers here that I want to kind of talk about. 92% of the data breaches that we know about are caused by human error. What this tells us is it doesn't matter. You can spend the most money on equipment. You can spend the most money on software, the most money on hardware. But if you don't have competent cybersecurity professionals behind that equipment, you're absolutely not going to have success in securing your data. And that's part of why I put this course together. Now, I'm recording this, with a professional, the very best professional recording studio in the world, the very best professionals in the world that do recording. But there's also been times where I've been on these sets doing recordings where the people that I did the recording with had bigger, fancier equipment, really expensive equipment. They would even boast to me that they spent $20 million on all their equipment. But the skill set behind those cameras was not as good, and that showed in the end product. So what I'm saying to you is, if you come to this right now and you take the things that we're doing in this course and really build your skill set around that and not go on the deep end and just start, dog pedaling to try to swim, you will find that you will have a long-lasting, successful career because you will have built your skill set on a foundation that's not related to tricks, not related to specific equipment or tools. You will have a foundation that you can take and build success with any tool. Now, some other scary statistics, and I'm going to tell you why this one's the most scary. 207 days is the average time it took in 2020 for organizations to discover that they were breached. Now, keep in mind, I have a pretty in-depth incident response course on the InfoSec Skills platform, specifically to take people that don't know incident response and give them foundational hands-on skills they can use right away. Let me tell you what's most troubling about this 207 days. In 2018, that number was about 170 days, is the amount of time it took organizations to know that they're breached. In 2018, that number was about 196 days. Now, 2019 and now up into 2020, it's 207 days. What I'm telling you is the number is going up, and that is not a number that we need to see going up. With all the money that we're spending on equipment, with all the new technologies coming out, machine learning this, AI that, deep learning this, oh, we're going to solve all of our security problems with AI and machine learning. Why is the number going up? Why is it taking organizations longer to find out that they're breached? I think a key point to that is because the people that are behind those tools and behind that AI are training that AI, training those algorithms with skill sets that aren't up to par. Because you can use AI, machine learning, deep learning, whatever you want. I always say garbage in, garbage out. The third number that I want to deal with is the number of files the average employee has access to. And this is staggering. This is a staggering number. The average employee in the US has access to 11 million files. 11 million. Now, I could tell you, I know people in my orbit, my personal orbit, that I wouldn't want them having access to 10 to 11 files because their cyber hygiene and their security hygiene is so terribly bad. And these are good friends of mine, and they know what I do for a living, and I'm always coaching them and telling them not to do things, but they're like poster childs for how to get, phished or how to be victims of the Nigerian scam emails. Half my family has made the Nigerian princes rich, from some of the things that they do all the time. But the average employee has access to 11 million files. Think about that. Let that number sink in. So if I can compromise one of your employees, let's say you're a company or you work for a company that has 1,000 employees, I consider myself to be a decent hacker. Right? I don't think I'm an elite hacker. I don't think I'm the top in the world, but I think I'm pretty decent. Do you think the chances of me being able to exploit or successfully phish at least one of your 1,000 employees, what do you think that number is? What do you think my chances are? Because I see employees getting phished by terrible, very bad phishing attacks. So what that tells you is it's very likely that some of your employees are just gonna get compromised no matter what. You all that are taking this course, you can put yourself in a position to be a buffer to try to stop that, because the battle of trying to pit the employees against the threat actors, this is a battle that's going to be around for a long time. This is why we need products like Security IQ and other things that will allow us to constantly improve the knowledge level of the average end user employee. But this course is not for the average end user. It's for you all that are trying to come into this field to come on the front line with this and help fight this problem. Because 11 million files per employee is a staggering amount, and it gives us an almost impossible odd as far as protecting it. But now we have some tools and we have some ways to approach that. And hopefully you coming into this, you're excited about joining this fight, because I can tell you it's the most rewarding career that I can think of. And I've done a lot of different things. And, as far as success and money, it's definitely there if you want to do it. But these are some of the fundamentals that we're going to dig into as we go throughout the course. Now, as is the case for this course, if you want more content from me, you can go to this website right here, and you will see all of my training content listed out for you. And feel free to, subscribe and comment on it. Thank you for joining this course. Go ahead and go to the next one immediately, because you're going to jump right into some of the operating system fundamental stuff. Thank you again. Hope you enjoyed it.